In the winter of 1941, as snow settled over Europe and the war raged across continents, one man stood at the center of a decision that would alter the course of history. Adolf Hitler believed he understood the world better than his enemies did. He believed he understood nations, economies, and the will of people. And when he looked across the Atlantic Ocean, he saw not a threat, but a weakness. To Hitler and much of the Nazi leadership, the United States was not a true military power. It was, in their eyes, a nation softened by comfort, divided by politics, and corrupted by what they saw as cultural and racial inferiority. They dismissed American society as chaotic and incapable of unity. In their worldview, shaped heavily by ideology rather than reality, strength came from rigid control, discipline, and a singular national identity, qualities they believed America lacked entirely. This belief wasn't just casual arrogance, it became part of Germany's strategic thinking. Throughout the 1930s, as Germany rearmed and expanded, American isolationism reinforced this perception. The United States had avoided direct involvement in European conflicts for decades. Even as war broke out in 1939, America remained officially neutral. To Hitler, this seemed like confirmation. The Americans had neither the will nor the courage to fight a large-scale war. But this interpretation missed something crucial. While America stayed out of direct combat, its industrial engine was quietly awakening. Factories were expanding, shipyards were preparing. Programs like Lend-Lease were already sending massive amounts of equipment to Britain and the Soviet Union. The United States was not idle, it was gearing up. Germany, however, saw only hesitation. Then came December 7, 1941. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor shocked the world and brought the United States into the war, but only against Japan. At that moment, Hitler faced a choice. He was not obligated to declare war on America. In fact, some of his advisors urged caution. Germany was already deeply engaged on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union, a conflict far larger and more demanding than expected. Opening another front, especially against a country with vast industrial potential, was a dangerous gamble. But Hitler didn't see it that way. On December 11, 1941, just 4 days after Pearl Harbor, Germany declared war on the United States. It was one of the most consequential decisions of the entire war. Hitler's reasoning was shaped by the same assumptions he had held for years. He believed America would struggle to mobilize. He believed its industry would be inefficient and slow. He believed internal divisions, political, social, and racial, would prevent it from becoming a unified war machine. He also believed that Germany, already dominant in Europe, could strike decisive blows before the United States could even fully react. In the early months, it almost seemed like he might be right. German forces were at their peak. Much of Europe was under Nazi control. The Wehrmacht had advanced deep into Soviet territory. In the Atlantic, German U-boats began a devastating campaign against American shipping. The East Coast, poorly defended at first, became a hunting ground. German submarine commanders referred to this period as a happy time. Ships were sunk in alarming numbers. Oil tankers burned within sight of American shores. It looked like the United States was vulnerable, unprepared, exposed, and slow to respond. This only reinforced German confidence. But beneath the surface, something far more powerful was taking shape. America's response was not immediate, but it was relentless. Unlike Germany, which had already stretched its resources thin across multiple fronts, the United States had something unique: untapped capacity. Its industrial base was not just large, it was adaptable. Factories that once produced cars, refrigerators, and consumer goods began transforming into producers of tanks, aircraft, and weapons. And they did it at a pace that few had imagined possible. Very traits that Nazi ideology dismissed as weaknesses, diversity, decentralization, and economic freedom began to show their strength. American industry was not rigid, it was flexible. It didn't rely on a single centralized system. It thrived on competition, innovation, and rapid problem solving. While German planners expected delays, inefficiency, and confusion, instead they faced something entirely different. They faced scale. Within months, shipyards were launching vessels faster than German U-boats could sink them. Aircraft production surged, training programs expanded. Millions of workers, men and women, entered the labor force, filling factories and assembly lines. The United States was not just preparing for war, it was redefining what warfare looked like. Yet at this stage, German leadership still underestimated the transformation. Reports from the front and intelligence sources began to hint at America's growing power, but they were often dismissed or downplayed. The belief in American weakness had become deeply ingrained. It no longer was just an assumption, it was a bias. And that bias would prove catastrophic. Because wars are not won by ideology alone. They are won by logistics, production, and the ability to sustain effort over time. Germany had built a powerful war machine, but it was not designed for a prolonged global conflict against an opponent with virtually unlimited industrial capacity. By declaring war on the United States, Hitler had done more than open another front. He had activated an entire continent. What he saw as a divided, fragile society was beginning to unite with a singular purpose. What he believed to be a weak economy was rapidly becoming the most powerful war engine in history. And what he dismissed as an inferior opponent was about to challenge and eventually overwhelm the very foundations of Nazi strategy. The fatal miscalculation was not just underestimating America's strength, it was misunderstanding its nature entirely. Because the United States did not need to be the strongest at the beginning, it only needed time. And by the time Germany realized its mistake, that time had already changed everything.
By early 1942, the United States was officially at war on two fronts, separated by vast oceans and facing enemies who had already been fighting for years. On paper, the situation looked dangerous. America's military was relatively inexperienced, its forces still mobilizing, and its enemies, Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, were at the height of their power. But the true story of America's entry into the war was not written on battlefields. It was written in factories, shipyards, and assembly lines. Almost overnight, the country began transforming itself into something the world had never seen before, a nation fully mobilized for industrial warfare. President Franklin Roosevelt had already laid the groundwork before the U.S. formally entered the war. In 1940, he called for the United States to become the arsenal of democracy, a phrase that would soon define the entire war effort. At first, it meant supplying allies like Britain and the Soviet Union with weapons and equipment, but after Pearl Harbor, it took on a much larger meaning. Now, America wasn't just supplying others, it was preparing to supply the entire war. Factories that once produced civilian goods began to shut down their old lines and retool for war production. Automobile plants stopped making cars and started building tanks, trucks, and aircraft engines. Typewriter companies began producing rifles. Even consumer appliance manufacturers found themselves assembling military equipment. The scale of this transformation was staggering, and at the center of it were individuals who didn't just follow orders, they reinvented how things were built. One of the most remarkable figures was Henry Kaiser, an industrialist who had never built ships before the war, yet within a short time he became one of the most important shipbuilders in the United States. Kaiser approached shipbuilding not as a traditional craft, but as a process that could be broken down, simplified, and accelerated. Instead of constructing ships slowly, piece by piece, his teams used prefabrication. Sections of ships were built in different locations and then assembled together like giant building blocks. Workers were trained quickly, tasks were streamlined, and production lines were optimized for speed. The result was something almost unbelievable. Liberty ships, massive cargo vessels essential for transporting supplies across the Atlantic, began rolling off production lines at record speeds. What once took months to build could now be completed in weeks. In one famous case, a ship was assembled in just over 4 days. To German planners, this defied logic. Their entire strategy in the Atlantic depended on sinking Allied shipping faster than it could be replaced. But now, replacement wasn't just possible, it was happening faster than destruction. And shipbuilding was only part of the story. In Michigan, the Ford Motor Company constructed the Willow Run plant, a facility dedicated to producing B-24 bombers. It was one of the largest factories in the world at the time, designed specifically for mass production on an unprecedented scale. Inspired by automotive assembly lines, the plant aimed to produce heavy bombers with the same efficiency as cars. At its peak, Willow Run was producing one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. Think about that for a moment. An aircraft weighing over 18 tons, filled with complex systems and thousands of parts, rolling off an assembly line roughly every hour. This wasn't just production, it was industrial acceleration at a level no one had ever witnessed before. And it wasn't limited to a few factories. Across the country, millions of Americans joined the workforce to support the war effort. Women entered factories in massive numbers, taking on roles that had previously been closed to them. Farmers increased food production, engineers developed new technologies, workers labored around the clock, often in shifts that never stopped. The American economy didn't just grow, it reshaped itself entirely. Between 1940 and 1945, U.S. industrial output nearly doubled. Aircraft production alone reached nearly 300,000 units over the course of the war. Tanks, trucks, weapons, ammunition, everything was produced in quantities that dwarfed anything Germany or its allies could manage. And unlike Germany, which struggled with resource shortages and constant bombing, the United States had a crucial advantage: its distance. Its factories were far from enemy attack, its infrastructure remained intact, its resources, steel, oil, manpower, were vast and largely secure. This allowed production to continue without interruption, steadily increasing month after month. At first, German leadership failed to grasp what this meant. They had built their war plans around speed, quick victories, rapid campaigns, decisive battles. Blitzkrieg had worked in Europe because it overwhelmed opponents before they could fully respond. But the United States wasn't responding with speed alone. It was responding with endurance. Every ship sunk could be replaced. Every aircraft lost could be rebuilt. Every setback on the battlefield could be absorbed and corrected. The American system, driven by industry and innovation, was designed not just to fight, but to outlast. And slowly, the balance began to shift. The early months of the war had exposed weaknesses in American preparedness, but as production surged, those weaknesses began to disappear. Equipment shortages turned into surpluses, training programs expanded, supply lines strengthened. The United States was becoming something its enemies had never truly anticipated: a nation capable of sustaining total war on a global scale. For Germany, this posed a problem that no battlefield victory could solve, because even if they won battles, even if they inflicted heavy losses, they were now facing an opponent that could replace those losses faster than they could inflict them. The implications were enormous. War was no longer just about tactics or territory. It was becoming a contest of production, logistics, and time. And in that kind of war, the United States held an advantage that grew larger with every passing day. What began as a dismissed and underestimated nation was rapidly turning into the backbone of the Allied war effort. Ships, planes, weapons, and supplies flowed not just to American forces, but to allies across the world. Britain held on, the Soviet Union fought back, and behind both of them stood the growing power of American industry. The arsenal of democracy was no longer just an idea, it was a reality, and it was only just getting started.
By 1942, the war had expanded across continents, but one of its most critical battles was being fought in a place most people would never see, the vast, dark expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. It was here, far from the front lines and headlines, that Germany believed it could strike a decisive blow against the United States and its allies. The architect of this strategy was Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of Germany's U-boat fleet. Unlike traditional naval warfare, Dönitz's approach relied on stealth, coordination, and relentless pressure. His submarines would operate in wolf packs, hunting Allied convoys and striking with precision before disappearing back into the depths. The goal was simple but devastating: cut off the flow of supplies. Britain depended heavily on shipments of food, fuel, and equipment from across the Atlantic. Without these supplies, its ability to continue the war would collapse. And now, with the United States entering the conflict, those supply lines became even more critical. American factories were producing vast amounts of material, but it all had to cross the ocean. Dönitz intended to make sure it never arrived. In the early months of 1942, his strategy appeared to be working almost perfectly. The U.S. East Coast, unprepared for submarine warfare, became a target-rich environment. Merchant ships sailed with minimal protection, and coastal cities remained brightly lit at night, silhouetting vessels against the horizon. For German submarine crews, it was almost too easy. They called this period the Second Happy Time. Tankers burned within sight of American shores. Cargo ships vanished beneath the waves. In some cases, wreckage washed up on beaches. The psychological impact was just as significant as the material losses. This was no distant war anymore. It had reached America's doorstep. From the German perspective, this confirmed everything they had believed. The United States, they thought, was slow to react, disorganized, vulnerable. But once again, they were misreading what they were seeing. Because while the initial response may have seemed sluggish, it was already evolving. The United States Navy, along with its British and Canadian counterparts, began implementing convoy systems along the East Coast. Instead of sailing alone, merchant ships grouped together under naval escort. This made them harder targets and allowed for coordinated defense. At the same time, technological advancements began to shift the balance. Radar systems improved detection capabilities. Sonar allowed ships to locate submarines beneath the surface. Long-range patrol aircraft extended coverage over areas that had previously been unprotected. The Atlantic, once dominated by stealth, was becoming increasingly dangerous for U-boats. But perhaps the most decisive factor wasn't tactics or technology, it was production. Every ship sunk by German submarines represented a loss, but in a traditional war, such losses would accumulate, eventually crippling supply lines. That was the assumption behind Dönitz's entire strategy. What he hadn't accounted for was the sheer speed at which the United States could replace those losses. Shipyards across America were operating at full capacity, producing Liberty ships faster than ever before. While U-boats continued to sink vessels, new ships were being launched at an even greater rate. The numbers began to tell a different story, one that Germany could not ignore. For every ship sent to the bottom, another took its place, and another, and another. The math of the Atlantic War was changing. By late 1942 and into 1943, the tide began to turn. Convoys grew stronger, escorts became more effective. Air coverage expanded further into the ocean, closing what had once been deadly gaps. U-boats, once the hunters, were increasingly becoming the hunted. Losses among German submarines began to rise sharply. Entire wolf packs were intercepted and destroyed. Experienced crews, difficult to replace, were lost along with their vessels. The very strategy that once brought success now exposed them to growing risks. Dönitz faced a harsh reality. His submarines were no longer operating in a favorable environment. The Atlantic was no longer a hunting ground. It was becoming a battlefield they could not control. And behind this shift was something far more powerful than any single weapon or tactic. It was the combination of adaptation and industry. The United States had not only learned from its early mistakes, it had corrected them at speed. It had taken a vulnerable coastline and turned it into a defended system. It had taken scattered shipping routes and turned them into coordinated lifelines. And most importantly, it had taken losses and made them irrelevant. Because as long as ships could be replaced faster than they were destroyed, the strategy of attrition would fail. For Germany, this was a devastating realization. The U-boat campaign had been one of their best chances to weaken the Allies without direct confrontation. It had relied on a simple principle: choke the enemy's supply lines, and victory would follow. But now those supply lines were not just surviving, they were expanding. American equipment, fuel, and troops were crossing the Atlantic in ever-increasing numbers. Britain remained supplied. The Soviet Union continued receiving aid. The Arret effort, instead of collapsing, was growing stronger, and there was little Germany could do to stop it. The Atlantic campaign revealed a fundamental flaw in German strategy. They had assumed that war could be won by disruption alone. But they were facing an opponent that could absorb disruption, adapt to it, and overcome it through sheer scale. The wolf packs had failed because they were ineffective. They had failed because they were up against something far greater than they had anticipated, an industrial power that could not be easily exhausted. By the time Germany fully understood this, the opportunity had passed. The Atlantic was no longer theirs to dominate, and the flow of American power across the ocean had become unstoppable. By late 1942, American industry was surging. Ships were crossing the Atlantic in growing numbers, and supplies were reaching every corner of the Allied war effort. But there was one problem that factories alone could not solve. War is not won in assembly lines. It is won on battlefields. And when American forces first met experienced German troops in North Africa, the gap between production and performance became painfully clear. The first major test came at Kasserine Pass in February 1943. U.S. forces, many of them inexperienced and newly deployed, faced off against seasoned German units under the command of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. These were not the broken or overstretched forces that propaganda often suggested. These were veterans of years of combat, disciplined, coordinated, and highly effective. The result was a shock. American lines faltered under pressure. Units became disorganized. Communication broke down. German forces exploited weaknesses quickly and decisively, pushing U.S. troops back and exposing serious flaws in leadership and coordination. For German commanders, it seemed like confirmation of everything they had believed. The Americans, they thought, lacked experience. They were unprepared for the realities of modern warfare. Their equipment might be abundant, but their ability to use it effectively was still in question. Even Rommel, one of Germany's most respected commanders, initially viewed American forces as inexperienced and tactically immature. And to a certain extent, he was right, but only for a moment, because what happened after Kasserine Pass would begin to change that perception entirely. Unlike many armies that crumble after early defeats, the United States treated failure as a lesson. Command structures were reevaluated. Ineffective leaders were replaced. Training programs were intensified. Communication systems were improved. Coordination between infantry, armor, and air support was reworked to function as a unified force. The response was not slow. It was immediate. Within weeks, adjustments were already being implemented, and within months, the results began to show. American forces returned to the battlefield in North Africa with greater cohesion and confidence. They adapted to German tactics, improved their defensive positioning, and learned how to use their numerical and material advantages effectively. This ability to learn and adapt became one of the defining strengths of the U.S. military. German commanders began to notice the change. Reports from the front started to shift in tone. The same soldiers who had struggled at Kasserine were now fighting with increasing effectiveness. Coordination improved, resistance stiffened, counterattacks became more organized and more dangerous. Rommel himself would later acknowledge that American forces were improving rapidly, far faster than expected, and this created a new kind of problem for Germany. Because while American industry was producing the tools of war, American soldiers were learning how to use them, and doing so at a pace that narrowed the experience gap with every engagement. In Sicily and later in Italy, this evolution became even more apparent. U.S. forces operated alongside British and other Allied troops, gaining further experience in complex operations. Amphibious landings, combined arms tactics, and large-scale coordination became more refined. Mistakes still happened. Progress was not perfect, but it was consistent. And consistency, over time, became transformation. By 1944, the difference was undeniable. American forces were no longer inexperienced newcomers. They were a fully capable fighting force, able to plan and execute large-scale operations across multiple theaters. The D-Day invasion in Normandy would soon demonstrate this on a massive scale, requiring precise coordination between land, sea, and air forces, something that would have been unthinkable just a year earlier. For Germany, this shift was deeply concerning. Their early assumptions had been based not just on ideology, but on initial observations, and those observations had reinforced a dangerous belief that American forces would remain ineffective. But war is dynamic, and the United States was changing faster than Germany could adapt. This was the critical difference. Germany relied heavily on experience gained early in the war, but as the conflict stretched on, it faced increasing challenges: resource shortages, stretched supply lines, and the growing pressure of fighting on multiple fronts. The United States, on the other hand, was improving. Its soldiers were gaining experience, its commanders were learning from mistakes, its systems were evolving, and all of this was supported by an industrial base that ensured a constant flow of equipment, supplies, and reinforcements. It wasn't just that America could produce more, it's that it could learn faster. And in war, that combination is incredibly powerful. The early defeat at Kasserine Pass, rather than proving American weakness, became a turning point. It exposed flaws, but it also triggered change. It forced the U.S. military to confront its shortcomings and fix them quickly. In doing so, it revealed something German planners had failed to anticipate: resilience. The ability to absorb failure without collapsing, the willingness to adapt under pressure, the capacity to improve not over years but over months. By the time Germany began to fully recognize this shift, it was already too late. The Americans they had once dismissed were no longer the same force. They had become something far dangerous, an army backed by unmatched production, driven by constant adaptation, and capable of turning early setbacks into long-term strength. And as the war moved closer to Europe itself, that transformation would play a decisive role in what came next. By 1944, the war had entered a new phase. What had once been a series of rapid German victories was now a grinding global conflict stretching across continents. And at the center of this shift was a force Germany had never fully understood: not just the American military, but the full weight of American production. Because by this point, it was no longer about whether the United States could fight. It was about whether Germany could survive what America had become. Factories across the United States were operating at levels never before seen in human history. Day and night, without pause, they produced aircraft, tanks, trucks, ammunition, and supplies in staggering quantities. This wasn't just support for American troops, it was support for an entire alliance. By the end of the war, the numbers alone told a story that was impossible to ignore. Nearly 300,000 aircraft had been built. Around 86,000 tanks rolled off production lines. More than 2 million military trucks carried troops and supplies across battlefields around the world. But numbers on their own don't capture the full impact, because every one of those machines represented something more than steel and engineering. It represented mobility, firepower, endurance, the ability to replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. And that is what began to break Germany's ability to continue the war. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union was pushing westward with increasing force, supported in part by American equipment delivered through Lend-Lease. Trucks, fuel, food supplies, all of it helped sustain massive offensives that Germany struggled to contain. In the West, Allied forces prepared for the largest amphibious invasion in history. When they landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, it was not just a military operation, it was a demonstration of logistical dominance. Thousands of ships, landing craft, and aircraft operated in coordination, supported by a continuous flow of reinforcements and supplies. Germany, by contrast, was running out of time and resources. Its industry, already strained, was under constant attack from Allied bombing campaigns. Factories were destroyed, transportation networks were disrupted, fuel shortages became critical. Even when Germany could produce weapons, it often lacked the means to deploy them effectively. The imbalance grew larger with every passing month. German commanders began to face a reality that no battlefield tactic could overcome. They were not just fighting armies, they were fighting an entire industrial system that stretched across an ocean, largely untouched and continuously expanding. Even the most advanced German weapons, the Tiger tanks, the V-2 rockets, the jet-powered Me-262, could not compensate for the lack of numbers and sustainability. These innovations were impressive, but they came too late and in too few quantities to change the outcome. Meanwhile, the United States continued to produce, and produce, and produce. The war had become a contest of endurance, and in that contest, Germany was outmatched. What made this situation even striking was how predictable it had been, if only German leadership had been willing to see it. The United States had always possessed the resources, the population, and the industrial capacity to become a dominant force in a prolonged conflict. But those factors had been dismissed, ignored, overlooked because they didn't fit within a preconceived narrative. Nazi ideology had painted America as weak, divided, and incapable. It had reduced a complex nation into a simplistic stereotype, and in doing so, it had blinded decision-makers to the reality of what they were up against. By the time the truth became undeniable, it was irreversible. German forces found themselves increasingly overwhelmed, not just by enemy soldiers, but by the sheer volume of equipment those soldiers carried. Allied units were better supplied, more mobile, and constantly reinforced. Losses that would have crippled other armies were absorbed and replaced. There was no pause, no relief, just constant pressure. And that pressure came not only from the front lines, but from the skies, the seas, and the factories thousands of miles away. As 1945 approached, the collapse was inevitable. Allied forces advanced from the west, Soviet forces closed in from the east. Germany, once dominant across Europe, was now surrounded, outproduced, and outmatched. The ultimate outcome of the war was shaped by many factors: strategy, alliances, leadership, but one that was most decisive was this: Germany had fundamentally misunderstood its opponent. It had prepared for a different kind of war, a shorter war, a war of rapid victories and decisive blows, but instead it found itself in a long war against a nation that thrived in exactly that environment, a nation that didn't need to win quickly, only completely. In the end, the misjudgment of American power was not just a strategic error, it was a fatal one. It influenced decisions at the highest level, from declaring war to shaping military expectations. And those decisions set Germany on a path it could not recover from. Because once the full force of American industry, adaptability, and endurance was unleashed, there was no realistic way to stop it. The outcome was not sudden. It was built over time, ship by ship, plane by plane, truck by truck, until the balance of the war was no longer a question. And what began as confidence, rooted in assumption and ideology, ended in collapse. Not because Germany lacked strength, but because it failed to recognize where true strength was coming from.